Examine this photograph carefully. A faded sepia image taken in 1901, showing a young girl standing alone against a weathered cabin wall. Her skin and hair appear unnaturally pale, almost luminescent against the dark wooden backdrop. Her expression is vacant, yet somehow piercing. This is the only known photograph of Eve Whitlam, the albino girl, who, in the bitter winter of 1901, was responsible for a devastating fire that reduced the entire village of Ravenscroft to ashes and claimed 47 lives. The official records would classify the incident as a tragic accident, but documents recently uncovered from sealed provincial archives tell a far more disturbing story, one of superstition, medical anomalies, and institutional failure that culminated in what local newspapers would later call the Pale Judgment of Ravenscroft. Tonight, we delve into these newly declassified documents and speak with descendants of the survivors to piece together the true story behind one of the most haunting yet least understood tragedies of the early 20th century. Our story begins not with the fire itself, but 17 years earlier in the autumn of 1884, when Dr. James Whitlam, a respected physician from Edinburgh, arrived in the remote mining village of Ravenscroft with his young bride, Marion. The village, nestled in a narrow valley surrounded by dense pine forests, had been established 30 years prior when coal was discovered in the surrounding hills. By the time of the Whitlams' arrival, Ravenscroft had grown to a community of nearly 200 souls, mostly miners and their families, living in close proximity in timber-framed houses clustered around the mine entrance and the village's small church. Dr. Whitlam had been recruited by the mining company to tend to the frequent injuries and ailments that plagued the miners, replacing the previous physician who had succumbed to tuberculosis the previous winter. According to the parish registry, which survived the fire by virtue of being stored in a metal box in the church's stone vestry, the Whitlams were initially welcomed to the community, with the traditional feast held at the home of the mine overseer, Robert Blackwood. Marion Whitlam, however, was noted in several personal correspondences from the time as being, quote, peculiar and withdrawn. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, the overseer's wife, wrote to her sister in Manchester that the new doctor's wife speaks seldom and smiles never, keeping her eyes downcast in a manner most disconcerting to those attempting conversation. This initial impression would prove prophetic, as Marion's integration into village life would be complicated by subsequent events. Archives from Ravenscroft's Company Hospital indicate that Marion Whitlam suffered 3 miscarriages in the first 2 years of their residence in the village. Dr. Whitlam's personal journal, partially recovered from the ruins of their home, contains increasingly desperate entries regarding his wife's physical and mental deterioration following these losses. In an entry dated March 12, 1886, he writes, "M's melancholy deepens. She speaks now only of darkness and cold, refusing to leave her bed even as spring approaches. The villagers have begun to whisper. I hear them fall silent when I enter the company's store. Their superstitions are medieval, but I cannot deny that there is something in M's eyes that I myself cannot name or understand." The doctor's concerns regarding village superstition were not unfounded. A statement given in 1902 by former Ravenscroft resident Thomas Harrow, who had been away selling timber when the fire occurred, referenced beliefs that had begun to circulate that Marion Whitlam was touched by the shadow, a local euphemism for demonic influence. The women wouldn't take her hand at church, Harrow recalled. They said her skin was cold as a corpse's, and that she could see through to a person's soul with those strange, pale eyes. Despite this growing social isolation, parish records confirm that Marion Whitlam gave birth to a daughter on December 21, 1887, the winter solstice, a detail that would later feature significantly in the village's supernatural interpretation of events. The birth was difficult, lasting nearly 30 hours and requiring the assistance of not only Dr. Whitlam himself but also the village midwife, Agnes Thorne. The child, christened Evangeline Rose Whitlam but known simply as Eve, was born with complete albinism, a condition Dr. Whitlam documented meticulously in his medical journal. The infant presents with complete absence of pigmentation, with skin of translucent pallor, hair of the purest white, and eyes of a peculiar reddish hue that reflect light in a manner similar to that of certain nocturnal animals. While I recognize this as a rare but natural medical condition, the midwife crossed herself repeatedly and would not look directly at the child. Indeed, Agnes Thorne's own diary, preserved in the Provincial Historical Society's collection, describes the birth in far more ominous terms. "Never in my 40 years of bringing souls into this world have I assisted in the delivery of such a child. It emerged silent, with eyes open and knowing, pale as death itself, and with blood-red eyes that seemed to glow in the candlelight. God forgive me, but I could not suppress a cry of alarm. This is no natural child." The birth of Eve Whitlam marked a definitive turning point in the family's already tenuous relationship with the Ravenscroft community. Dr. Whitlam's professional standing prevented outright ostracism, but his detailed records document a steady decline in patients seeking his services for anything but the most serious injuries. Miners' wives began to consult Agnes Thorne for common ailments rather than visit the doctor's surgery, particularly after Marion began to assist her husband with Eve beside her. A letter from Dr. Whitlam to a medical colleague in Edinburgh dated September 1888 expresses his growing concern. "I find myself in an increasingly untenable position. My scientific understanding of Eve's condition means nothing to these people, who cross themselves when we pass and hang rowan branches above their doors. Marion has withdrawn completely from society, refusing even to attend Sunday services, which only fuels the rumors. I have contemplated relocating to a more enlightened community, but Marion's fragility makes travel impossible at present, and I confess I fear the reception my daughter might receive elsewhere." Marion Whitlam's mental state continued to deteriorate as Eve grew into a toddler. Household accounts indicate that Dr. Whitlam hired a young woman from a neighboring village, Sarah Collins, to assist with both childcare and the management of the household, as Marion became increasingly bedridden. Collins would later provide one of the most comprehensive first-hand accounts of Eve's early development, in a statement given to provincial authorities investigating the fire. "The child was unnatural in her behaviors," Collins testified. "She rarely cried, even as an infant, but would stare with those red eyes for hours at a time. She learned to speak early, in complete sentences, but would often refuse to speak for days, only to recite passages she had heard once, perfectly, weeks later." Mrs. Whitlam alternated between periods of complete disinterest in the child and episodes of intense, almost desperate affection, during which she would not allow Eve out of her sight, even to sleep. Medical records maintained by Dr. Whitlam confirm that Eve's physical development was normal despite her condition, though he noted a pronounced sensitivity to sunlight that necessitated limited outdoor activity, primarily at dawn or dusk. This restriction further set the child apart from others in the village and contributed to the growing lore surrounding the Whitlam household. A school register from 1893 indicates that an attempt was made to integrate Eve, then 6 years old, into the village school. This experiment lasted precisely 3 days before Dr. Whitlam withdrew his daughter following an incident documented in both his journal and the schoolmaster's records. According to the schoolmaster, William Parker, the Whitlam girl was seated alone, as no child would share a bench with her, when she suddenly announced that David Murray's father would be taken by the earth before the week's end. The statement caused considerable distress, not least because Murray's father was a pit supervisor in excellent health. When Samuel Murray was indeed killed 2 days later in a mine collapse, the other children refused to enter the schoolhouse, while the Whitlam girl remained in attendance. From this point forward, Eve's education was conducted at home by her father, and, increasingly, by Eve herself, who displayed an extraordinary capacity for autodidacticism. Dr. Whitlam's library acquisition records, preserved in his accounts, show orders for advanced texts in mathematics, natural philosophy, and classical literature that would be considered beyond the capabilities of most adults in the community, let alone a child. Sarah Collins' testimony notes that by the age of 8, Eve was reading medical texts from her father's library and making annotations that Dr. Whitlam himself described as insightful. This intellectual precocity, combined with her physical appearance and isolation, only served to deepen the village's unease. Thomas Harrow's statement references a belief that had begun to take hold that the girl had been touched not by mortal learning, but by some darker knowledge. The pivotal tragedy that would set the stage for the eventual fire occurred on February 17, 1897, when Marion Whitlam took her own life. The official death certificate, signed by the district coroner rather than Dr. Whitlam himself, lists the cause as drowning due to temporary insanity, but Dr. Whitlam's journal entries suggest a more complex situation. M has ended her suffering. He wrote on the evening of her death, "I found her in the bath. Her wrists opened with my surgical scalpel. The precision of the cuts suggests a dreadful clarity of purpose. Eve discovered her first, yet showed no visible distress. When I arrived, she was seated beside the bath, holding her mother's cold hand and speaking softly in Latin, a funeral oration from Cicero that I do not recall her ever reading. I cannot fathom how she knew it, nor can I dismiss the disturbing serenity with which she told me. Mother said the darkness was calling. Now she has answered." Marion Whitlam's suicide prompted an intervention from church authorities, who insisted on a proper Christian burial despite the circumstances of her death. A concession Dr. Whitlam attributed in his correspondence to his professional standing, rather than any genuine compassion from the community. The parish record notes that the service was sparsely attended, with most villagers watching from a distance as mother and daughter stood alone by the graveside. Sarah Collins, who remained with the family until 1900, reported that Eve maintained an unsettling vigil following her mother's burial, sitting at her bedroom window each night, staring toward the cemetery on the hillside, sometimes speaking in whispers as though conducting a conversation with the deceased. Dr. Whitlam's journal entries in the years following his wife's death reveal a man increasingly divided between scientific rationality and growing unease about his daughter's behavior. "Eve's intellectual development continues to astound and disconcert me," he wrote in December 1898. "She has mastered calculus without formal instruction, and has begun to develop what appears to be a system of symbolic logic that exceeds my understanding. Yet I cannot ignore certain incidents that defy rational explanation. Last week she described to me in precise detail the symptoms of a patient I had not yet examined, including an internal malignancy that presented no external signs. When I asked how she could possibly know this, she replied only that, 'The shadows tell me things, Father.'" A subsequent entry, dated April 1899, notes, "I discovered E this morning in my surgery, administering the correct treatment to Mrs. Blackwood's boy for his fever. When questioned, she claimed that she had observed me often enough to understand the principles of medicine better than I do myself. What disturbs me is not the presumption, but the possibility that she may be correct." Sarah Collins' departure from the Whitlam household in January 1900 coincided with a series of troubling incidents in the village that, while never directly attributed to Eve in official records, feature prominently in the oral histories collected from survivors and descendants. Livestock died unexpectedly. Children reported seeing a pale figure watching them from the edge of the forest. 3 separate house fires occurred, though all were extinguished before causing significant damage. The connection between these events and the Whitlam household remained speculative until the discovery in 1997 of a sealed deposition from Robert Blackwood, the mine overseer, given to provincial authorities following the tragic fire. In this document, Blackwood describes a confrontation with Dr. Whitlam in December 1900. "I approached the doctor with the concerns of the village council regarding recent disturbances. Though I spoke only in general terms, Whitlam became immediately defensive, insisting that his daughter was the victim of ignorant prejudice. When I mentioned the fire specifically, I observed a change in his demeanor. Not anger, but fear. He asked me, 'Has anyone reported seeing her near the sites?' When I acknowledged that a child had claimed to see a pale girl watching the Thompsons' barn burn, Whitlam abruptly terminated our conversation, stating only that he would take appropriate measures. These measures appear to have involved increased restrictions on Eve's movements, as Dr. Whitlam's final journal entries reference a new lock installed on her bedroom door, and his decision to secure all flammable materials in a locked cabinet in his surgery. The doctor's growing concern is evident in his final dated entry, January 17, 1901, just 3 days before the catastrophic fire. He grows more withdrawn and resentful of my restrictions. This evening I found her standing before the hearth, staring into the flames with such intensity that she did not respond to my calls. When I touched her shoulder, she turned to me with an expression I cannot adequately describe. Not anger, precisely, but a cold, evaluating gaze that seemed to measure my worth and find it wanting. She said only, "The fire speaks to me, Father. It tells me that everything must be purified." I administered a mild sedative and secured her in her room, but I confess that for the first time, I fear my own child. The events of January 20th, 1901, the night of the Great Fire, must be reconstructed from fragmented evidence, as no resident of Ravenscroft Central Village survived to provide a complete account. What is known with certainty is that the fire began shortly after midnight, originating in the Whitlam residence, according to the official investigation. Weather records indicate unusually high winds that night, with gusts exceeding 50 miles per hour, conditions that would have facilitated the rapid spread of flames among the closely situated timber structures. The first alarm was raised by a miner returning from the late shift, William Thorne, who survived only long enough to report seeing, quote, "the doctor's house engulfed and the pale girl standing in the street, surrounded by flames that seemed to bend away from her." This statement, recorded by the district magistrate who interviewed Thorne before he succumbed to his burns, would be dismissed as the delirious imagination of a dying man were it not for corroborating evidence discovered decades later. In 1967, during renovations to the provincial courthouse, a sealed evidence box was discovered containing items recovered from the Ravenscroft fire that had never been catalogued in the official investigation. Among these was a partially melted metal box containing a journal written not by Dr. Whitlam but by Eve herself. The existence of this journal was suppressed by provincial authorities until 1995, when Freedom of Information legislation finally made it accessible to researchers. The contents, though damaged and incomplete, provide a chilling insight into the mind of the 13-year-old girl in the months leading up to the tragedy. The villagers fear what they cannot understand. One legible passage reads, "Mother understood this. She told me before she departed that I would need to be stronger than their fear. I have studied the nature of fire. It is transformation, not destruction. All things return to their elemental state eventually. I shall be the instrument of this necessary change." A final entry, dated January 19, 1901, the day before the fire, contains perhaps the most disturbing passage. "Father believes he has contained me, like one of his specimens. He does not understand that what dwells within me cannot be contained by locks or walls. Tonight, I heard Mother calling from the cemetery. She says it is time for Ravenscroft to be cleansed. The shadows agree. They have shown me how to open the cabinet where Father keeps his chemicals. I am not afraid. In the new world that will emerge from the ashes, there will be no place for fear or ignorance, only purity and transformation." The official death toll from the Ravenscroft fire was 47 souls, including Dr. Whitlam. Eve Whitlam's body was never recovered, despite extensive searching of the ruins. This absence gave rise to persistent rumors that she had somehow survived the inferno she had created. These rumors gained credence in 1903, when a physician in a sanitarium nearly 100 miles from Ravenscroft reported treating a young albino girl with severe burns who had been found wandering on a rural road. According to his medical notes, the girl, who gave no name and spoke only in Latin quotations, died of her injuries after 2 days. No formal identification was ever made, and the girl was buried in an unmarked grave in the institution's cemetery. The legacy of the Ravenscroft tragedy extends beyond the immediate loss of life and property. The provincial government's apparent suppression of evidence, particularly Eve Whitlam's journal and the testimonies that suggested supernatural elements, speaks to the institutional discomfort with narratives that challenge rational explanation. Historian Dr. Eleanor Richards, who has extensively studied the case, suggests that the authorities, reluctance to acknowledge the possibility that a 13-year-old girl deliberately caused the fire reflects a broader cultural unwillingness to confront the potential for calculated violence in children. The official narrative of accidental fire was more palatable, Dr. Richards notes, than acknowledging that a child, particularly a female child, could harbor such destructive intentions. Perhaps most disturbing are the reports that emerged in the decades following the fire, from communities across the region, of sightings of a pale, white-haired woman in the vicinity of unexplained fires. While most can be dismissed as folklore arising from the Ravenscroft story, certain details in these accounts, particularly descriptions of the woman quoting Cicero in Latin, are specific enough to give even skeptical researchers pause. The most recent such report, from 1987, comes from a retired firefighter who claimed to have seen a woman with skin and hair white as snow, untouched by the flames, at the edge of a forest fire near the original Ravenscroft site. When he approached, she reportedly told him, "Ignis aurum probat," fire tests gold, before vanishing into the smoke. The Provincial Historical Society maintains a small exhibit on the Ravenscroft tragedy, including the single surviving photograph of Eve Whitlam, with which we began our exploration. Visitors often report an unsettling sensation when viewing the image, a feeling that the girl's reddish eyes seem to follow them as they move. Curators have noted the unusual frequency with which the glass covering the photograph has cracked, despite no apparent physical trauma. In 2018, a small fire broke out in the exhibit room, damaging several displays but leaving the Whitlam photograph untouched. The cause was never determined. As we conclude our investigation into the tragic tale of Eve Whitlam and the destruction of Ravenscroft, we are left with more questions than answers. Was Eve truly responsible for the devastating fire, as her journal suggests? How do we reconcile the documented intelligence and precociousness of this child with the calculated violence attributed to her? What are we to make of the reports of sightings in the century since the tragedy? And perhaps most unsettlingly, what does our enduring fascination with this story tell us about ourselves, about our own relationship with that which we cannot explain or control? The ruins of Ravenscroft remain today, stone foundations partially reclaimed by the forest, a silent testament to a tragedy that defies simple categorization. Local residents still avoid the area after dusk, claiming that on particularly cold nights, one can sometimes see a pale figure moving among the remnants of the village, her white hair illuminated by moonlight, her red eyes reflecting the flames of a fire that burned out more than a century ago but somehow continues to smolder in our collective imagination. If you're intrigued by this dark chapter in history, subscribe to our channel for more explorations of the unsolved mysteries and suppressed histories that challenge our understanding of the past and perhaps offer warnings for the future. Next week, we delve into the abandoned laboratories beneath Blackwood Asylum and the controversial experimental treatments conducted there in the name of medical progress.